to take a seat. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. I think we'll get started. I'm Jeff Collins, Professor of Early Modern European Studies and Chair of Academic Programs at the Bard Graduate Center. And on behalf of all my colleagues, I am delighted to welcome you to what is this 22nd convocation of the Françoise and Georges Selz Endowed Lectures in 18th and 19th Century French Decorative Arts, Design, and Culture. I'd like to extend a special welcome to those who are joining us via the internet as part of our live streaming program. We call it BGC TV. And I invite those of you who are here virtually to participate by tweeting your comments and questions to hashtag BGCTV. I will do my very best with this device to field them and make you feel present. I remind everyone that this is the second of 3 of this year's Selz series, and the third and last will take place on Tuesday, April 1st. That is not a joke. When Max Tillmann will come and speak about Elector Max Emanuel of Bavaria's patronage of French decorative arts around the year 1715. So as you can see, we have a very full house tonight. I think this may, in fact, be a record for the number of attendees in a Selz lecture. That's no accident, and as Dean Peter Miller observed earlier today, tonight's event hits the sweet spot of French cultural studies, involving both textiles, which everyone loves, and Marie Antoinette, whom everyone loves to hate. Or at least they did in the late 18th century, when this poor Austrian transplant was demonized in some circles as embodying everything that was wrong with the French monarchy and, in fact, with monarchy in general. Indeed, Marie Antoinette's bad reputation has itself been the subject of scholarly research, including Chantal Thomas's 1999 study, The Wicked Queen, The Origins of the Myth of Marie Antoinette. Just as noticeable are recent attempts to recuperate or rehabilitate this icon of the Ancien Régime, and one thinks not just of Sofia Coppola's eponymous film, but of playwright David Adjemi's play of the same name, which we saw last year at the Yale Rep and then here at the Soho Rep. More important for our purposes have been scholarly attempts to rehistoricize an often decontextualized historical figure of pop culture by reinserting her in an appropriate cultural or political or historical milieu. And it's in that category that I would put studies by scholars like Carrie Weber, whose Queen of Fashion, What Marie Antoinette Wore to the French Revolution, was published in 2006, and Meredith Martin, whose book Dairy Queens, The Politics of Pastoral Architecture from Catherine de' Medici to Marie Antoinette, was published in 2011. No accident that both of those scholars are former Selz lecturers. It's very much in this historical vein that tonight's Selz lecture will take place, and since Meredith is back with us tonight, I've actually asked her to kick off our discussion period with a few questions and reflections to stimulate discussion and debate. Tonight's guest, Professor Birgitt Borkopp-Restle, holds the Werner and Margaret Abegg Chair as the Professor of the History of Textile Arts at the Institute of Art History at the University of Bern in Switzerland. After earning a PhD in art history from the University of Bonn, she began her museum career at the Schnütgen Museum in Cologne and as a curatorial assistant at the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg. In 1993, she was appointed curator of the Department of Textiles and Costumes at the Bayerisches Nationalmuseum in Munich, where she curated exhibitions based on the museum's collection while publishing and teaching courses on the history of textile arts at the University of Augsburg and Bamberg. From 2005 to 2008, she was director of the Museum of Applied Arts in Cologne while continuing to teach at the University of Bonn, Dortmund, Dusseldorf, and Basel. Now, as the Abegg Chair in Bern, since 2009, she has established MA and PhD programs for the history of textile arts. Her research focuses on medieval and early modern textiles, their role in court ceremony and court representation, and the exchange between the Orient and the West from the 16th through 18th centuries. Among many other publications, she's the author of Textile Treasures from the Renaissance and Baroque from the collection of the Bayerisches Nationalmuseum, and a study of the textile collection of 19th century Aachen theologian and historian Franz Bock, published by the Abeck Stiftung in 2008. Tonight, she's going to tell us how to do things with textiles, Marie Antoinette at the courts of Vienna and Versailles. So please join me in welcoming Professor Birgitt Borkopp-Restle.
Thank you very much, Jeppe, for the kind introduction. And thank you all for coming. I feel very honored by this invitation by the Bard Graduate Center, and frankly, perfectly overwhelmed by so many people who have come to listen to my talk. Before I launch into it, actually, I would like to warn you that at some points, I'm going to go a bit into technical detail. I will keep that very brief so as not to bore my textile colleagues in the audience, whom I'm very grateful to for having come, but hopefully I will also not bore anybody else. Some of you may have wondered if the title of my talk, now I'm going to try to move this forward, yes. If the title of my talk refers to the popular books that offer welcome advice when it comes to decorating your home or dressing properly for specific occasions, or if it indeed refers to John L. Austin, the Oxford linguist and philosopher's seminal book, How to Do Things with Words. I have indeed found this book useful beyond purely linguistic interests. Without stretching the comparison too far, I would like to argue that textiles could be used as a kind of language and to demonstrate that they acted in situations regulated by certain conventions as media for the communication of representative, directive, or expressive acts. A study of Marie Antoinette and her use of textile material and textile objects allows some valuable insights into these practices. The youngest daughter and last of the numerous children of the Empress Maria Theresa was educated at the Habsburg court in Vienna with a view to her mother's political strategies. The latter sought to strengthen her position by marrying her children into the important European courts of her time, and thus creating a network of alliances by these carefully arranged marriages. Thus, Marie Antoinette, first Archduchess at the imperial court in Vienna, came to be Madame la Dauphine, wife of the French Dauphin, the heir to the throne, and after the accession of Louis XVI, Queen of France, and in the end to share his fate and lose her life after the French Revolution. The dramatic events involved in her life and death have led to powerful, if sometimes contradictory, images of her that still provoke strong reactions. Depending on the interest or perspective of a viewer, she may appear as the last impressive queen of the Ancien Régime, or the spoiled fashion victim who, through her sheer extravagance, provoked the French Revolution almost single-handed. And this shows the box of Pandora, and it is perhaps important to note that Pandora was also the name given to the fashion dolls with which French fashions were spread on the continent. They used dolls that were clothed in the latest fashion to send or practically advertise these dress styles, and that was brought into connection with Marie Antoinette. She may also have been seen as a fashion queen whose style and creativity inspires designers until this present day, or as a frivolous and ultimately tragic heroine of romance and costume films. Of her certainly impressive wardrobe, there's practically nothing left. Just one single item of clothing has survived that can be attributed to Marie Antoinette with some certainty. A so-called grand corps, a corset completely stiffened with whalebone, that is preserved in a rather fragile state in the Fashion Museum of the city of Paris, Palais Galliera. There are archival sources, however, letters and reports from her contemporaries. There are pictures, namely portraits, and there are objects such as tapestries, furniture, and other things that were either made for Marie Antoinette or that played an important role in the ceremonies that gave form to the important events in her life. Every study of these objects must take the repercussions and interpretations into account that they have provoked already, and it must try to remove all these additional layers and get to the core of what they were and meant. For a few moments in the history of these objects and of Marie Antoinette, I propose to do this. On May 7, in 1770, the 14-year-old Marie Antoinette made her first step onto French territory after an official ceremony that introduced and handed her over as the bride of the Dauphin. From contemporary reports that describe her reception, we know that the event took place in an ephemeral architecture, a construction that combined elements of a wooden pavilion with those of a tent, that had been erected for the purpose in a small island called Ile des Épis in the Rhine near Strasbourg. The building enclosed a string of rooms that Marie Antoinette entered as an Archduchess of Austria. Proceeding through these rooms, she was transformed into a French princess before, in a kind of throne hall, the official documents pertaining to the marriage were signed. When she left the pavilion at the other end, her arrival in France and her change of roles were completed. In biographies of Marie Antoinette and in Sofia Coppola's film, this event was related in a dramatic scene. We see the heroine travel in a coach to a remote place. She is received by a lady of honor, and this lady is made to look very severe in the tight-lipped governess type, who then explains that Marie Antoinette has to take leave of everything that adheres to or reminds of her native country. And that also includes taking off her clothes down to the last thread, so that she can be clothed as befits a French Dauphine. In the film, the scene marks, it is a classical rite of passage if ever there was one, the transition from one country into a different one, and from one role, that of one of several imperial daughters and archduchesses, who were largely free of stately obligations, to a different one, namely of the future Queen of France, with the habitus, the decorum, and the visibility that are part of this role. In the film, and as I'd like to stress, in reality, for here, the film script precisely follows the contemporary sources, this transition is described as one between two cultures that are clearly distinguished by two highly important aspects: ceremony and dress. Especially at the French court, these two aspects were closely linked. We will come back to this point. The film suggests that Marie Antoinette had, before she crossed the French border, worn clothes that were different from the ones she received then. Perhaps clothes that were defined and could be recognized as Austrian or Habsburg in style. We know, however, that this was not the case. In preparation of her marriage and the negotiations leading up to it, the imperial court in Vienna had not only hired a French dancing master, Jean-Georges Noverre. We know him as an extraordinarily important and influential author of theoretical treatises on dance and movement, but also imported huge amounts of French fabrics, lace and accessories, and finally called on French advisors in order to create, for and with Marie Antoinette, the perfect appearance of a princess à la Française. When the painter Joseph Ducreux sent to Vienna from the French court with a commission to paint a portrait of Marie Antoinette so that Versailles would know what she looked like, took on this task, he found that his sitter indeed presented herself as a young princess in the French style. The dress that Marie Antoinette is wearing here not only follows French fashion in its cut and decoration, it was also, and as we may assume purposefully, made from a fabric that for the contemporaries represented, perhaps like no other, the extraordinary ability of the French, namely the Lyonese silk industry. It is a taffetas chiné à la branche. And I'll explain what this is. The fabrics of this type are, insofar as weaving technique is concerned, the simplest thing you can possibly make. In fact, they are tabbies or taffetas in French. They normally are very fine, having about 80 warp threads per centimeter, but this is not unusual in a French 18th century silk. The particular appeal and the extreme costliness of these silks rest on their patterning. That requires a dyeing of the warp threads before the weaving in units of several threads at a time only and in precisely defined compartments. You can see here that the pattern practically comes in steps. It has a broken contour. And this indicates the bundles of threads that have been dyed along the length. So this part would have been dyed orange and then left undyed and then receive another color and the yellow and then be left undyed, and you have to go along every bundle of threads and dye it in steps. The threads are then mounted onto the loom and woven with wefts of a single background color, most often white. The result is a fabric with a pattern in rather light colors and slightly blurred contours. The process is described in detail in the third volume of the Encyclopédie des Arts et Métiers, published in 1753, with a remark, and I translate, this process of making the chiné certainly is one of the most delicate processes ever invented in the arts, and it describes how it is done, and then says, the best fabric will be the one with the smallest number of different colors, and the most beautiful will be the one that has the colors arranged in the best way and in which the contours are the most precisely defined. Precisely, but with this little unevenness, impreciseness around them. It is obvious that Ducreux aimed at representing the material of Marie Antoinette's dress in this portrait so that the contemporaries would recognize it immediately. It has two colors against a white background. The slightly imprecise contours are very visible, and this careful rendering is retained in the graphic reproductions that were published and distributed in France soon afterwards. The future Dauphine presents herself as the perfect ambassadress of a decidedly French dress style and of the French silk industry, one of the pillars of French economy at the time. And this is done before she even arrived in France. The Archives Nationales in Paris preserve a book that goes back to the Comtesse d'Aussin, one of the ladies of honor of Marie Antoinette. It holds, besides small samples of fabrics, written notes concerning different types of dresses: grand habit, robe pour panier, robe pour petit panier, etc. It seems that it served to document the objects on which, ultimately, large sums of money were spent that had to be underwritten by the Contrôleur Général des Finances. I will not go into detail with regard to the interpretations of this book and its purposes. I would only like to mention that it documents that Marie Antoinette, even after she had become Queen of France, frequently wore dresses made from chinée à la branche silks. None of her dresses have been preserved, but in the important textile collections of the world, the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York, the V&A in London, the Musée Galliera in Paris, and in the Kyoto Costume Institute, we still find a number of dresses fashioned from this material and dating from the period between 1760 and 1780, so that we are fairly well acquainted with their cut and construction. The lightweight silk taffeta was obviously considered the ideal material for spring and summer dresses. They usually have no lining. That means you can see here, this is the outside of the dress, but here you see practically the inside of the back part of the dress that has no lining. This dress has a lining only in the sleeves, but not in the body part of it. So that the character of a very light dress is best preserved. Keeping this in mind, a particular detail seems all the more remarkable. In one of the chinée à la branche dresses of the Bayerisches Nationalmuseum in Munich, and, as I found out, also in other similarly lightweight dresses of the period, there are small pieces of lead sewn into the insides of the sleeves. You see them here and there. The largest measure about 3 centimeters in diameter and are 2 to 3 millimeters thick. They usually are covered with a linen or cotton fabric so as not to be immediately visible. I must say that whenever I talked to colleagues in costume collections about these lead weights in dresses, I would sometimes hear, "Oh yes, we have also a dress that has these weights." But you don't find that published. This is a detail that has never been really mentioned heretofore in catalogues of dress. What was the purpose of these lead pieces? Why had they been put there? They cannot really prevent the sleeves from riding up the wearer's arms. You could have achieved that far better with smaller pieces of lead sewn into the seam of a sleeve all around. And we can see in a lot of portraits of the period that the sleeves do appear a bit crumpled and pushed upwards, so even if that occurred, it cannot have been much of a problem. I am convinced that the purpose of these weights was to keep the wearer's attention awake for the position, or better, the carriage of her arms, and to remind her that the gracefulness she was expected to demonstrate required permanent control and carefully measured movement. This brings us back to Marie Antoinette. A series of portraits of the imperial children that Jean-Étienne Lyotard painted in Vienna in 1762 shows the young archdukes and archduchesses occupied with the activities that were part of their education. We see Maria Josepha at her harpsichord, Peter Leopold conceiving a fortification, and Marie Antoinette, aged 7, with a textile work. In her right hand, she holds a shuttle, and in her left, the thread that is mounted on the device. She is sitting upright, her shoulders stretched open, looking at the viewer. What kind of handicraft is it that she is executing there? We know this only from the 18th century, in particular the second half of the 18th century. The French call this activity parfilé or parfilage. In English, it is called knotting, and knots are what it produces. With the turn of the shuttle, a thread is interlooped in such a way that a regular and dense series of little knots appears along its length. That's about it. Why would one want to do this? The result, a thread with a series of little knots, is not something you would call useful. Objects in which such a thread appears are extremely rare. I know just one single example, and that again is an unpublished object, a juste au corps that belongs to the collections of the museum in Munich, that has its front and sleeves decorated with a knotted thread. And I show you a detail so that you can see what that means. This is nothing but a length of thread with tiny knots, one following the other, and you can, of course, lay that onto any surface and fix it there in some decorative pattern. Of course, someone like Marie Antoinette would not have created this kind of object. That was perhaps left to some servant or so, if anyone wanted to do anything at all with these lengths of thread. So we haven't really objects in which this result of the work is preserved. What has been preserved are, on the one hand, a number of portraits depicting ladies occupied with this activity, and it seems remarkable that this is a portrait from the French court. Madame Adélaïde is one of the sisters of Louis XV, Marie Antoinette's father-in-law. And on the other, we have the shuttles that were used to do this, and which were often fashioned from precious materials, from ivory, silver, or porcelain, and they were lavishly decorated. They are about this size, 10, 12 centimeters long, so something that would look decorative if you handle it, and it allowed the ladies to demonstrate the graceful movements of their hands and wrists by doing this. It seems obvious that it was not the result, but the process of knotting that was important. The use of the shuttle requires, once you have acquired the routine, which is easy, no further attention. It is an activity one can pursue while following a musical performance or participating in a conversation at the same time. I think that the important point of this was to practice the activity in order to be seen and eventually be portrayed doing it. This again aims at two aspects. For centuries, the pictorial media have established a connotation of female handicraft with female virtues. It seems appropriate, however, to consider which female virtues precisely are meant here. We can clearly see that the bourgeois virtues of the 19th century, namely the prevention of idleness and extravagance, and the kind of housewifeliness that makes good use of the product of time spent, have no place in this. We must rather imagine that the aristocratic idea of female virtue was inspired by a heroine like Penelope, the wife of Ulysses, who, during the day, wove a shirt that she unraveled by night. Faithfulness, patience, and strategical intelligence are part of this concept of virtue. And the second aspect is the carriage of the body and its graceful movement. Both are first practiced and then demonstrated with the activity of knotting. Instructions given by a dancing master or through treatises published to this end, but also the construction of her dresses all work together to give Marie Antoinette the graceful carriage that her contemporaries noticed and praised in her. Head held high, shoulders wide open, and arms held up, elbows turned slightly away from the torso, classical ballet has retained this movement. We do not know if Marie Antoinette practiced knotting with pieces of lead sewn into her sleeves, but there are indications to show that the construction of her dresses paid particular attention to the effect on her movement. The lady of honor whose gazette we have seen was responsible for all the fabrics, dresses, and accessories that were made for the queen. She also had an active role in her dressing and undressing. Under her direction worked a maître, probably a master tailor, 3 valets, servants, 1 tailleur de corps, who made and maintained the stiffened corsets, 1 faiseuse de collerette, who made the textile ornaments for neck and shoulders, an embroideress, 3 hairdressers, and 1 empaiseuse de manches, a woman who gave weight to the sleeves. We probably must not imagine that the work of this particular person consisted solely in sewing pieces of lead into sleeves. I rather assume that she would have been responsible for everything pertaining to the construction and decoration of these sleeves, all the frills, bows, lace, and passementerie employed in this context. But the denomination of this particular task and person indicates that the weight was actually more important than the decoration, or, to put it differently, that the construction of a dress ultimately aimed at the carriage and movement of the wearer, and would have been an empty shell without this. In the reception of the young princess in the pavilion near Strasbourg, other textile objects played an important role and received particular attention and a remarkable resonance. In accordance with traditions in courtly representation, the building had been furnished with precious tapestries. For the main hall, that is, the space in which the ceremony of the remise, the official handing over of the bride, was to be held, a series had been chosen that represented in 7 large-scale hangings the history of Jason and Medea. The series, designed by Jean-François de Troyes and woven in the Manufacture des Gobelins, came from the Mobilier Royal, the royal wardrobe, so to say, in which furniture and other objects needed for such occasions were kept. I will briefly, following the tapestries, sum up the story that these textiles told. In order to be accepted as the heir to the throne in his native country, the hero, Jason, has to procure from faraway Colchis the golden fleece. With a group of companions, called after their ship Argo, the Argonauts, he sets sail, and eventually, after an adventurous journey, he arrives in this country. The king of Colchis promises to let him have the golden fleece, but only after he will have performed two very difficult tasks. Medea, the daughter of the king and a powerful sorceress, has, however, fallen in love with Jason. She promises to help him, but only on the condition that if he succeeds, he will take her with him and marry her. Jason agrees. The series begins with Jason promising to remain faithful to her, and Medea, in turn, offering to help him with her magical powers. The second tapestry shows a dramatic scene. With the help of Medea, Jason masters the first task. He yokes a herd of fire-breathing bulls and employs the beasts to plough a field into which he then plants a seed of dragon teeth. The following hanging shows the seed coming alive. Men in armor appear, who first threaten to harm Jason, but after Medea has thrown a stone among the crowd, they turn their weapons against each other. The fourth tapestry depicts Jason taking the golden fleece after he has put the dragon to sleep that had been keeping watch over the precious object. Together with Medea, Jason sets out to return to his native country, but they never arrive there. Inclement winds force them to seek shelter in Corinth, where they, now married, remain for several years and have 2 children. But then Jason falls in love with Creusa, the daughter of the Corinthian king, and breaks the promise he had given to Medea. Raging, she turns her magical powers into the weapons of her revenge. She fashions a beautiful dress and presents it to Creusa as a gift. When the woman puts it on, however, flames spring up and burn her. But Medea's wrath is not only directed against her rival. In the 7th tapestry, she stabs the 2 sons she has borne to Jason, sets fire to the town and court of Corinth, and finally disappears in a carriage propelled by dragons. There is no document preserved from the French court that ordered or explained the furnishing of the pavilion for the remise with this particular series. There is, however, a contemporary description that communicates a lively impression of this effect. The young Johann Wolfgang Goethe, at the time a student in Strasbourg, had handed over a small sum of money to the guards and thus gained access to the building. He had done that especially to see the tapestries with which the pavilion had been furnished. And I quote, "I went and came and came and went and could not satiate myself with looking. I found the side chambers highly delightful and refreshing, but the main hall so much the more shocking. This had been hung with many larger, more brilliant and richer hangings, which were surrounded by crowded ornaments, worked after pictures by the modern French." With modern French he means painters contemporary to himself. Now, I might perhaps have become reconciled to this style also, but the subject was excessively revolting to me. These pictures contained the history of Jason, Medea, and Creusa, and therefore an example of the most unhappy marriage. To the left of the throne was seen the bride struggling with the most horrible death, surrounded by persons of sympathizing woe. To the right was the father, horrified at the murdered children before his feet, whilst the Fury in her dragon car drove along in the air. Doubtless, so continues Goethe, the size of the chambers, and I'm still quoting, had guided the royal tapestry keeper. With animation and vehemence, he says, I called on my comrades to witness such a crime against taste and feeling. What, cried I, is it permitted so thoughtlessly to place before the eyes of a young queen, at her first setting foot in her dominions, the representation of the most horrible marriage that perhaps ever was consummated? Is there, among the French architects, decorators, upholsterers, not a single man who understands that pictures represent something, that pictures work upon the mind and feelings, that they make impressions, that they excite forebodings? It is just the same as if they had sent the most ghastly spectre to meet this beauteous and pleasure-loving lady at the very frontier. My comrades tried to quieten me, that there might be no offense. Then they assured me that it was not everybody's concern to look for significance in pictures, and that to themselves at least nothing of the sort would have occurred. End of quote. This report, published in Goethe's autobiographical text Poetry and Truth, had its repercussions in art historical literature. Recent publications still argue that, as Goethe had already assumed, the tapestries had been chosen because they fitted the length of the walls, and because their especially fine material recommended them for a festive occasion. A study published in 2011 on the reception of the story of Jason and Medea from the Middle Ages into the 18th century still insists that, I quote, obviously the people in charge had no reservation as to whether the subject of the tapestries was suitable for the reception of a bride or not. End of quote. I would like to contradict this and argue instead that the tapestries were indeed chosen deliberately and purposefully for the reception of Marie Antoinette. First of all, the selection of tapestries, and that means of the pictorial programs for a particular event, never lay in the responsibility of decorators or tapissiers. They were far too important for that. Decisions of this importance were, just because they had a bearing on political representation and protocol, were taken by a prince himself, or at least by a person he or she had charged with a correct and appropriate preparation of the ceremony in question. This person had to be perfectly acquainted with the traditions involved and with the different layers of significance, indeed significance, that could be more or less directly called upon. In our particular case, these traditions and layers of significance can be described precisely. Marie Antoinette was a Habsburg princess, and the history of her dynasty included the Duchy of Burgundy. The Order of the Golden Fleece, founded by the Dukes of Burgundy, was perhaps the most important inheritance the House of Habsburg retained from their Burgundian ancestors. Marie Antoinette would have understood the representation of the Jason and Medea story as a gesture of reverence for the tradition of her family. After all, she had witnessed, 2 years before her marriage, the reception of her brother, Archduke Franz Joseph, later the Emperor Franz II, into the Order of the Golden Fleece. The Jason and Medea tapestries, made in the Gobelin workshop, not only refer to a historical tradition in terms of the story or an iconographical program, however. They actually refer to a tradition in the use of the same medium. When Charles the Bold of Burgundy had married Margaret of York in 1468, the bridal chamber had been furnished with a tapestry series that depicted the story of Lucretia, not a harmless subject either. The banqueting hall had been hung with a Jason series. Medea, described as a horrible fury by Goethe, had for centuries been valued and praised as a woman of virtue, as one of the femmes fortes, the strong women, whose revenge was caused and justified by the break of promise that Jason had confronted her with. It is this strong-willed woman that we see in the tapestries, and not only there. She appears in the same way in a number of operas and ballets composed during the 17th and 18th centuries, and we must keep in mind that both art forms had been conceived at the early modern courts of Europe. They are, in their early stages, aristocratic art forms. Marie Antoinette knew these theatrical productions very well. Jean-Georges Noverre, the dancing master who had trained her to move in society and on stage, had choreographed a Jason and Medea ballet in Vienna in 1767. In 1775, Marie Antoinette, then Queen of France, called him back to Paris as director of the Académie Royale de Musique, and the first ballet that he staged there was again a Medea. The theme also remained vital in the tapestries. The series that had adorned the pavilion of the Remise was, as we have seen, not an old one. It had been woven in the beginning of the 1750s for Louis XV. This was the first edition after the cartoons painted by de Troyes. During the next years, indeed right into the period of the French Revolution, another 11 editions followed this first one. One was given in 1771 to the Crown Prince of Sweden when he came to France on a state visit. Archduke Maximilian received another one in 1775. The Prince Bishop of Strasbourg, Cardinal de Rohan, yet another one in 1780. Napoleon actually gave Jason and Medea tapestries as precious gifts to his allies, with a crowned N in the border. Not all of these series comprised 7 tapestries. Some were reduced versions, so to say, but all of them included 3 particular moments of the story: Jason's promise of faithfulness, the death of Creusa, and Medea's revenge against Jason. For the contemporaries, these scenes represented the core of the story. In the context of Marie Antoinette's Remise, these tapestries presented to her the story of a strong woman who claimed faithfulness as her due and who took revenge when faithfulness was denied her. Her actions were dramatic and severe, but they were the actions she was entitled to after her husband's break of promise. It may well be that this pictorial program also expressed the hopes of certain circles within French court society, that the future king of France would do without the maîtresse en titre, so favored by his father and grandfather. These hopes, I would like to add, were less motivated by moral convictions, but rather by the experience that the maîtresse had often, and not unsuccessfully, influenced the king's politics. Goethe, the young man who had been born and educated in a family of wealthy Frankfurt citizens, could not understand the significance of the pictorial narrative. It was passed on from one generation to the next in the aristocratic media of tapestries, opera, and ballet, and it was understood at the European courts as a part of their tradition. What we see here, shortly before the French Revolution, is not a change of meaning for a specific subject, but we see different perceptions of the same subject that refer to different social groups or strata. Almost 2 decades separate Marie Antoinette's arrival in France from her violent death after the French Revolution. Decades in which she tried to establish herself in Versailles, became Queen of France, eventually bore the long-awaited heir to the throne, and created, in Versailles and Fontainebleau, apartments, pavilions, a theatre, and other spaces that document, until today, the goût Marie Antoinette, the Marie Antoinette taste. Textiles, furnishing fabrics, draperies, and dresses always had an important part in the designs. Before I conclude my talk with a final look at Marie Antoinette's fashion styles, I would like to show an example for the particular precision applied in the choice of textile materials for these interiors. From 1774 onwards, the Petit Trianon and the gardens surrounding the building in the Park of Versailles were remodeled as a maison de plaisance for Marie Antoinette. At the time, there were already a few gardens in France that, following English examples, favored carefully conceived landscapes over the older formal gardens. These new gardens provided the perfect backdrop for a new, sensitive perception of nature and of its tasteful and elegant description. For Marie Antoinette, the concept obviously also provided a welcome opportunity to withdraw from the French court politics and return, at least in a fantasy, to her happy youth at the Habsburg court. The site soon became known as Petit Vienne, or Petit Schönbrunn. The desire to fashion this into a country retreat inspired even the choice of materials or their representation in the furnishings. For Marie Antoinette's bedroom, Jean Demosthène Dugour designed a set of chairs, tables, and fire screens. The textile parts were entrusted to the Lyon firm of Defarge, weavers of fine silks and embroiderers. The set, called a chambre à treillage, imitates in the surfaces and the decoration of gilt bronze a lattice screen made of reed with floral branches winding around it. The fabric is different from all the other furniture we know from Versailles, not silk, but linen, and embroidered in colored wool. Never before had the goût rustique, the peasant taste, found such consequent expression than in this choice of materials. Court societies in early modern Europe knew spaces and situations that were free from regulations through protocol. In Versailles, the Petit Trianon and the domaine of Marie Antoinette in its entirety represented such a space. This also affected her dress style. In Versailles, the wearing of a grand corps, this corset that stiffened out with whalebone all round, and whenever she appeared in a situation labeled as public, also of the grand panier, this hooped underskirt to be worn under the grand habit de cour, was mandatory from Marie Antoinette. In her country retreat, these rules, this is the court appearance, the state portrait that shows her exactly as she had to appear in every official situation. In her country retreat, these rules did not apply. This is a small-scale, intimate portrait. It is just about that high and shows her, it was given as a gift to a friend, and it shows her in a riding dress, and we see especially here this hairstyle, which has nothing of this elaborate construction with feathers and gemstones as we see in the state portrait. Different dress styles were allowed as long as their choice respected court regulations, also in terms of precisely distinguished and separated spaces. Problems arose only with the crossing of borders, and this is what Marie Antoinette in the end did, in the name of fashion, a concept that had so far hardly played any role in court dress. The huge costs involved in her use of fashion, and they soon came to be seen and judged as extravagance, probably just added to a problem that was, in its core, the breaking of a rule. It concerned the appropriateness of a royal appearance. From 1775 onwards, Marie Antoinette appeared in official situations, and this included the coronation of Louis XVI in Reims, with remarkable hairstyles that included very high constructions decorated with ostrich feathers, gemstones, and pearls. Her appearance soon provoked comments in the French press, but also in letters from her mother, Empress Maria Theresa. And I quote Maria Theresa, she wrote this in French: "You know that I've always thought one should follow fashions with moderation, but never to exaggerate them. For a young, beautiful queen, all these follies are unnecessary. On the contrary, the simplicity of her parure, of the ornaments, gives her a better appearance and is more appropriate to the rank of a queen." And Marie Antoinette answers her, "It is true that I occupy myself a bit with my parure, and for the feathers, everybody wears them, and it would seem extraordinary if I did not." The following events proved her wrong, however. What is good for everybody, tout le monde, is not right for the queen. For her, the extraordinary is the appropriate. A scandal that one of her portraits provoked certainly demonstrates this. Since the state portrait that you've seen, that she painted of Marie Antoinette and that had been sent as a gift to the Viennese court, you can see it today in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, Elisabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun had been entrusted with all the official portraits of the French queen. In summer 1783, she presented in her first exhibition at the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture a painting that showed the queen in a lightweight muslin dress called a chemise shirt. This was a kind of dress that Marie Antoinette might have worn during her country pursuits in the park of Versailles. And I show you the portrait of one of the close friends of Marie Antoinette, who wears here a very similar dress, and she wears it even before. If you look at the date, this portrait was painted in 1782, and this here comes on 1 year later. So Marie Antoinette is not the first one to show this fashion, or to actually set a fashion with it. She follows even. But what is perhaps a very nice and beautiful and appropriate dress for this noble lady still is not the same for the queen. It was deemed inappropriate for an official appearance of the queen, and the presentation of her portrait in a public space was an official appearance of the queen. The presentation of this portrait there quite simply constituted a break of protocol. The reactions and comments were so violent that the painting had to be withdrawn from the exhibition after a few days. The painter replaced it very quickly with another that showed the queen, comme il faut, in a silk dress and with the appropriate accessories. The damage was done, however, and efforts to undo it with more and different pictures were not successful. Elisabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun consulted her mentor Jacques-Louis David, and with his help established once again the standard for the official portrait of the queen. It must come in a monumental format, and show the queen in an interior and with her children, thus hinting simultaneously at dynastic tradition and an ideal of female virtue. David recommended that Vigée Lebrun seek inspiration in Raphael's paintings of the Holy Family. And the portrait she finally realized demonstrates that she indeed followed his advice. All the effort could, however, not change the public opinion that had a new and unprecedented political power now. Of course, it was not the whims and fancies of the queen, however costly they proved to be, that accounted for the end of the Ancien Régime. On the other hand, Marie Antoinette can hardly be quoted as a woman who used fashion as a means of self-expression and who had tried, successfully or not, to define spaces for her independent creativity off court regulations. An analysis of her appearances, and especially of the textile objects and materials used in these circumstances, rather shows that she still had to move within a complex and long-established system of ceremonial rules that could be embroidered here and there, but not fundamentally changed. Time and again, textile objects or acts involving them served to communicate significance, to mark rank and status, or to request specific reactions. For the contemporaries, this code was clearly readable. For us, it takes a great deal of learning to understand and appreciate. I'm convinced, though, that if we study the materiality of these objects, understand how they were made and how they functioned, we can recover an understanding of historic situations and behaviors that would be lost to us otherwise. Thank you very much for following me so long.
So as promised, let me invite Meredith to the podium to start us off with some questions and thoughts, and then we can move naturally into a discussion period. Thank you. As you wish.
As you wish. As you wish. As you both wish. Thank you so much for that wonderfully rich and provocative, stimulating talk. I really learned a lot, and I'm sure that my fellow audience members did as well. And I have so many questions, but I know there must be some questions from the group, so I will just kind of start off to get the ball rolling, and then you can answer questions, I can help moderate, we can proceed as we wish. But I think maybe to get back to the beginning of your talk, maybe even the title, How to Do Things with Textiles, and then perhaps also a point that you brought up at the very end. I think in some of the recent reassessments of Marie Antoinette and her role at court that Jeffrey mentioned, there's been a real focus on her strategic manipulation of art, architectural, and fashion codes, in which sort of the agency lies with the wearer, the patron, the queen, as opposed to what she's wearing. And so I was really struck by your approach that's embedded within your title, and then that was very clear throughout, that you're kind of placing the agency on the object itself, or you're kind of letting the object speak first to tell the story as a sort of perhaps a kind of methodological mode of inquiry, but also to recover certain information about this history and about Marie Antoinette's use of fashion that kind of allows the object to speak. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit perhaps about those two different approaches, or perhaps about your own focus on objects and on materiality and how that has led to some of the conclusions that or not conclusions, but some of the wonderful information that you've told us about these objects.
Thank you very much. Let's say, as I started out as a museum person and someone who very much comes from the object part, I think I sometimes see in paintings or in the representations of textiles, and ultimately, of course, in the textiles themselves. Perhaps a bit more than someone who just comes from the painting side. And when I started looking at these early portraits, the Chiné à la branche dress, for example, to me, this kind of pattern, and I suppose to many of my textile colleagues, these patterns are recognizable. And then I start out to think, well, if this is a Chiné dress, it's a Lyon fabric, but she is not in Lyon, she's still in Vienna. So how does this come about, and why? And I mean, I always think or assume that in a portrait it is less the painter who decides what the sitter is wearing, but it's the sitter who says and decides how she wishes to be seen, and in this case perhaps not a 14-year-old girl herself, but the Viennese court would precisely decide how to show her off.
So that's what I want to jump in, because the question is sort of who is doing things with textiles, and I think the examples that you showed maybe have different questions. So who do you think chose that dress, and do you think she owned that dress, or do you think that dress was chosen in negotiation simply for representation? I mean, where is the agency?
Well,
hypothetical.
What we know from archival sources is that the Viennese court spent a lot of money on importing fabrics from France to fit her out in the French style before she even went there. So their strategy obviously was to present her as, let's say, ideal material for a person to represent the French crown and the French state. And as French economy rested for a large part on the production of textiles and the export of textiles, so it would have been an obvious choice to put her into a dress made from French fabric, and to show that she could represent this, her new country or her future country, in this particular way. They actually set her up as...
And the they would be?
They would be Maria Theresa, the Viennese court, who had actually planned and negotiated this marriage. It was, of course, a political marriage, and they did their very best to make that happen. On the other hand, the furnishing of the pavilion in Strasbourg would have been a gesture made by the French court, because the tapestry series belonged to the French Mobilier Royal. They were the ones to receive the bride, and they would furnish this particular space to receive her, to sign the contract, and so on. And they would certainly choose series of tapestries that either alluded to political messages that they wanted to bring over, or to make a gesture to welcome this particular princess with, let's say, the weight of her dynasty. So indeed, the persons who decide on what becomes active, what is seen, and what can be expressed by textiles changes.
Can I ask you then, maybe both of you, to talk about one of the mistakes? I mean, how do we account? Where's the agency in the portrait, in the chemise? I mean, how did that was obviously a miscalculation. Whose miscalculation was it? And what was the message that was meant and didn't get across?
Well, the decision to put this picture up in this Academy exhibition would have been at first one of the artists, but the artist would not have been able to do this without the consent of the Queen. So one must assume that Marie Antoinette herself did not realize the extent to which reactions to this portrait could go. It seems that at this point, and I mean, perhaps it is difficult for us to judge the dynamics of that situation immediately before the French Revolution. It seems that a lot of people at this point could not imagine what would happen, how dramatic events would be. And perhaps to weather off the idea of some break of protocol here and there, what does it matter? Is the public someone? But all of a sudden it became someone, and really a power that had to be reckoned with. And I think a lot of people have not really understood what was developing there.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right that it was a kind of shared decision probably on the part of Birgitt Borkopp and Marie Antoinette, because as Mary Sheriff has discussed, Marie Antoinette was instrumental in gaining her position within the academy, and I think Marie Antoinette really miscalculated her own exceptionalism. I mean, there were, as you said, she was not the first to wear this fashion, and she was among aristocratic women who were kind of following Rousseau and being their own kind of version of Julie, and there were certainly portraits. Birgitt Borkopp made one of Polignac, but Adelaide Lavigillard had displayed a portrait of another aristocratic woman, Madame Mitois, breastfeeding her child with one of these chemises at the salon with no apparent problem. I've seen a kind of miniature snuff box that was made out of it. It became a collector's item. This was a trend, and it was one that was welcomed by most writers, but it was not one that the Queen could easily inhabit. And I don't know that she fully kind of recognized that in embracing sensibilité and this kind of return to nature, that she couldn't inhabit the role as easily as other aristocratic women could.
And doing it at all is not the problem. The problem is in doing it publicly. That's the big difference that becomes, let's say, visible in these moments.
Maybe that's the perfect moment to open the questions to the
public.
floor.
Which came first, the ordering of the textiles or the negotiation?
Well, when Ducreux, the painter, he had been sent from the French court to Vienna to paint this portrait. At this point, the negotiations were already going, because there was no point for him to be sent there otherwise.
The textiles came after he was sent? They were ordered after he was sent?
No, they were there before, because he would not have been able to paint her in such a dress if there hadn't been dresses of this kind at the Viennese. She was prepared for this for quite a long time.
So which came first, the ordering of the textiles or the negotiations? The beginning of
No,
the
I think
negotiations.
the beginning of the negotiations would have come first. And when it seemed that this could have some success, that these negotiations became serious and she had to be prepared for a life and a role at the French court, then we see, let's say, the preparations becoming serious, hiring this high-profile choreographer as a dancing master for her, and buying so many. I mean, the expenses were heavy for all these textiles, and even the Viennese court would not have done that without, let's say, a perspective on a positive result of these negotiations.
Was there a rhetoric around different kinds of fabric which changed in some critical way in this period? So in this portrait, for instance, the dress is made out of what looks like a very thick velvet. Was there a way of describing or thinking about a fabric like velvet that underwent a shift in the 1780s in some critical way? Or muslin or silk?
Well, for an official portrait of the Queen, they would always have chosen a silk fabric. This is what is demonstrated if you look at this here. If this replaces the inappropriate chemise portrait, it's the silk fabric that has to be chosen to, let's say, show her in an appropriate way. And if we look at this velvet, if this is a velvet at the time was silk velvet. So it would have been a very heavyweight, precious fabric.
I was very interested about the correspondence you mentioned and the exchange letters between Maria Theresa and her daughter. And I was wondering if you could contextualize that a little bit, because as you explained, she asked her daughter to perform Frenchness somehow at the beginning, but suddenly it's going too far, and she asked her to go back to something more quiet. So can you just tell us a little bit more? I found that interesting and surprising.
Yes. Maria Theresa, of course, was interested in, let's say, her daughter performing well as the Queen of France. And there was a very extensive correspondence between the two, regularly transmitted through messages. And first of all, one important string in this correspondence is always the question, when will you be having the heir? When is a child, a male child, coming out of this marriage? This was the most important thing. And this is perfectly in accordance with something that would have been the very same in all European courts. Dynasty comes first. And this is what Maria Antoinette had to achieve. And then we can say, yes, of course, she was supposed to present herself as the French queen and someone who practically advertises French silk or French products. But we must also keep in mind that court dress at all the European courts, and we can see that in practically all the state portraits, is a rather conservative thing. Extravagant fashions do not really occur, or only very gradually and slowly find their way into court dress. And of course, Maria Theresa at this time was an elderly lady, and from Vienna, these new French fashions looked decidedly over the top. So, and she realized that in France, politically, something was going on that, say, at least gave cause for concern. And so she tried to moderate, or say, if this is indeed something that's seen as outré or extravagant, step down, don't do it that much, and so on. And I found Marie Antoinette's answer even more surprising than the question, because we have so often been told that she was someone who set fashions and who conceived fashions, and then to hear that she says, I'm doing it because everybody else is doing it. It's not my idea. This I found surprising, really. And I mean, the whole situation is one where the old tradition of court culture clashes with a new group in society coming up. Citizens, a bourgeois group of people who actually are more fashionable than the queen, and perhaps set a tone where she has to decide, follow, lead, where and how to find a position, and doing the same thing as everybody else is all of a sudden not what she's supposed to do. And in a way, the situation cannot succeed because she's really squeezed between the past and something that still hasn't found its form. But I've myself, when I started researching this, the amount to which she moved, let's say, within the established tradition of dealing with dress and textiles, I found that indeed surprising.
I have to move to from the sublime to the to the technical.
Yeah.
I like very much seeing the paintings of the knotted string and the holding the bobbin in one side and the tension of the cord on the other. Can you describe how the knot is made? Is the cord go over the bobbin or does the bobbin go into the cord?
Well, I must say, I've read about this, I didn't actually try it because these shuttles are extremely difficult to come by, and the Munich Museum has a few, but I wouldn't have been allowed to try them, actually. But the thing is that you have to hold the thread in one hand and move the shuttle so that it produces a little sling. And then a knot.
It seems like a lot of work to move the shuttle. First I thought that was what you were describing,
Yeah.
but then I wondered if the wrapping of the cord around is smooth, because the shape of that shuttle is quite smooth, that the cord would slip through. I wonder which hand is moving more, with the shuttle or with the cord.
I suppose that it is the shuttle. Because I go back to the picture. Because first of all, it's the right hand that's leading this movement in a way. And these shuttles are so highly ornate objects. They must have made wonderful presents to give within court society. And of course, one would have wanted to show off a little bit. I mean, she seems to have a golden shuttle. Ivory is the material of most of these objects that I have seen, but they also come in porcelain. And I think really the purpose of the whole activity is to show off the movement of your hand and wrist.
For me, this was really one of the most fascinating moments of your talk, because I will never think about this whole visual tradition of 18th century French women, Madame de Pompadour, Houzoun. I mean, and I think it really illustrates what you do so well, and starting with the object, in this case, this discovery of these lead weights, which leads you to think about the ways in which women are kind of primed to hold their hands in a certain way according to standards of etiquette, and then how this object facilitates that activity. I mean, I, for one, have thought about this I don't know, thinking back to 17th century Dutch genre paintings, or I thought about them in a kind of more conventional feminine virtue sense. And I, you know, and at the same time, having read art historians of Mimi Hellman, you know, thinking about the performance, the work of leisure, and this kind of performance of etiquette through objects, primarily through furniture, I should have thought of them that way, but until you showed those lead weights on the dress sleeves, I have to confess that I really hadn't, and I thought it was fascinating.
Thank you so much. And I really thought, thinking about this, that these early modern noble ladies were really far away from 19th century virtues that we know of, or still think of as virtues to be had. They have a completely different set of values, and 19th century bourgeois sensitivity had no part in their education. They were no sissies, they were really prepared to take all the hardships, and the pictures that they were surrounded with in any medium did not shy away from cruel or unusual behavior or situations. And if that was what it takes to keep up a dynasty, and then that's what is important.
Any last questions? Yes, in the back.
I have another more technical question. I forgot what she was called in French, the woman who sews the weights into the sleeves. Have you come across other references to somebody who designated specifically to do that? Because normally I would think that that would be done by the couturière when she makes the dress. And you were saying that maybe it was somebody who was responsible for the whole sleeve. Do you think that's different, again, from the couturière or from the marchand de mode?
Well, it seems that, of course, not all princesses who had staff to take care of their clothes would have had them to the same amount or so. And a lot of people would have, I mean, also Marie Antoinette bought things from marchand de mode, as we well know. But at the same time, she had a group of people working for and producing and maintaining her clothes. And as the Queen of France, this group of people was supposedly rather large. A duchess of wherever may have had perhaps only 2 or 3 people to look after her clothes. And to have someone specifically for looking at the sleeves and taking care of everything that pertained to these sleeves seems indeed rather, it seems to give a certain importance to what these sleeves meant. And I understand from the fact that there is one individual solely responsible for this part of dress that it must have had high importance in this whole concept of dress. And as I said, I don't think that she was only occupied with adding these little lead pieces into the dresses, but to name this person's occupation and responsibility after the weighting of the sleeves seems to indicate that this weighting was indeed important. And as we know, I mean, the importance of these dancing masters and what they taught young people can hardly be overestimated. And I mean, the Viennese court could have hired a lot of people probably to do this. And there must have been many, many anonymous dancing masters drilling the appropriate way of standing and walking and turning and so to little children with ambitious parents. But to have someone like Nouvelle brought over from Paris to Vienna to teach these young archduchess is really saying a lot.
Well, before we move next door for some refreshments, please join me in thanking Professor Borkopp.